Right, joining us now live from Washington, D.C. is Phyllis Bennis. She's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Phyllis, thanks so much for being with us here on Al Jazeera. Let me ask you first, how do you interpret these latest remarks by President Trump that the killing of protesters in Iran has stopped? Do you see this as some kind of off-ramp when it comes to all the threats that have been made about potential U.S. military action?
That's absolutely a possibility. I think the issue is we don't really know. We don't know who his sources are. He said that he spoke to high sources in the area, in the region, implying perhaps Iranian officials, but there's no clarity on what his source was, who told him that, who relayed the information. So it may well be that he's looking for a way to pull back from the threats. He still is making these threats of military action against Iran. There's still U.S. personnel leaving the U.S. military base in Qatar, the closest U.S. military base to Iran. And his statements to the protesters, calling on them to keep protesting, to take over the institutions, threatening Iranian officials at the same time, calling on the protesters to, quote, save the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a big price, implying somehow that the United States might be part of that. So the threats are still continuing. His latest statements that there are no more killings going on, we don't know for sure if that's true. As far as we know, the block on communications inside Iran is still largely holding. So it's very difficult to get good information.
Phyllis, obviously we don't know yet if this is indeed a de-escalatory move on the part of President Trump. But if it does turn out to be that, what diplomatic options are left for the U.S. to utilize when it comes to Iran?
Well, you know, when President Obama first negotiated with his team the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that was really the basis for much larger reins of diplomacy that could have gone forward. That was, of course, walked away from by President by President Trump when he took over in 2018. Since that time, there's been no serious diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. But the possibility of diplomacy is always there, the possibility that there could be negotiations even after the Israeli and U.S. attacks on Iran last June. At that time, it seemed that negotiations, that diplomacy was really no longer possible. But 6 months later, now, particularly given that the government in Iran is facing this enormous escalation in public protest, it might be possible to arrange through various intermediaries for some kind of diplomacy that could focus on the questions of Iran's nuclear capacity, the questions of U.S. sanctions, which are a large part of the reason for the economic crisis that has led to this level of protest in the streets throughout the country.
Phyllis,
all of that should be on an agenda, on a diplomatic agenda, not a threat of military force agenda.
Phyllis, you mentioned Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say whether that's going to be taken seriously by the U.S. and whether the Iranian government would respond, we still don't know, but that is certainly a possibility.
You mentioned those protests that have been going on. From your vantage point, do you think that these demonstrations that have been happening in Iran actually could bring about a power shift there?
I think it's still very hard to know. The regime has been cracking down with a great deal of violence on these protests, but it's also clear that parts of the population, particularly the business sector, has been participating at a level that had not been true in earlier protest movements. So there's more pressure right now internally on the government. Of course, whenever the U.S. government makes threats against the Iranian government, it discredits the protesters themselves. When the U.S. says, we welcome the protesters, we will protect the protesters, that certainly will not help them. That will not help the protesters. It gives the regime more excuses to crack down and to claim that it's not a legitimate protest. It does seem to be a very legitimate protest involving large sectors of the population. So if that goes forward, if that continues, and particularly if the level of violence against the protesters diminishes some, that will probably lead to less violence from those small numbers of protesters who have themselves used some violence, there could be the possibility for.
All right, Phyllis Bennis is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She joins us